the gut microbiome is actually the home to a lot of our neurotransmitter production, and a lot of the medications that we're using to try and rebalance these neurotransmitters. It's actually a symptom of what's happening in the gut with our gut bacteria. Hi, this is Greg Schmaus. Welcome back to the podcast. So today is a solo cast, just you and I today. And today we are diving into the current mental health crisis. It seems as though levels of anxiety, depression, addiction, OCD, ADHD, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, these rates of mental illness are at an all-time high. And today I wanted to take a little time to dive into this with you so you can understand some of the many root causes and what we can begin to do for ourselves and our loved ones to bring ourselves back into a state of balance and ease. So the first concept I'd like to introduce to you is what's called an evolutionary mismatch. An evolutionary mismatch essentially is the mismatch between our biology and our environment. So our biology hasn't really changed or evolved much in, say, the past 10,000 years. Our biology is still very similar to when we were hunters and gatherers, our ancestors that were living out in nature and exposed to the elements in the natural environment. But the truth is, our environment has so radically changed since then, and our biology has had a hard time keeping up with the adaptation. Right? So there's a mismatch between biology, our hunter-gatherer ancestors, what we were used to, the environment we were used to living in, and the radical change in our current environment with our processed foods, chemicals and pesticides, heavy metals, glyphosate, processed sugar, electromagnetics, technology, information consumption, all the overstimulation. Our environment is so radically different that it's been very hard for our biology to adapt. Our biology and the changes move at a much slower pace. Our environment, with all of our innovation and inventions and what we call progress, moves at such a faster pace that it's creating a huge stress response in our biology. Our autonomic nervous system is in a constant state of stress. And that stress response is now being expressed as different disease states, whether it's physical disease, autoimmune disease, digestive issues, et cetera, or mental illness in the form of anxiety, depression, addiction, and a lot of the various mental health challenges that we see today. So the first concept to really understand is the connection between our biology and our environment, the mismatch between the two, and how much this mismatch is expressing a stress response, and that expression is resulting in a lot of these disease states. The second thing we want to explore is the autonomic nervous system, right? And this is connected to, I will tie this into the evolutionary mismatch between biology and environment. So our autonomic nervous system, we have two branches. We have the sympathetic fight or flight response, and we have the parasympathetic rest and digest response. So that sympathetic fight or flight response is your survival response. It's there to keep you safe. It's there to keep you alive. And whenever there's a threat, whenever there's a big stressor, whenever there's something in your environment that might be a threat to you, that sympathetic response kicks on, and we either have the energy to fight or flight. All the blood flow goes from our organs to our extremities. And in that acute situation, it gives us the energy to seek safety, to flight, or to fight for our life. And once we get away from the threat, a few minutes, however long it is, then naturally our system would begin its rebalancing and we would return to more of a parasympathetic state, more of a rest and digest state. But unfortunately, with the current changes in the environment and the biology that's having a hard time keeping pace, our autonomic nervous system is ending up stuck in this fight or flight response 99% of the time. So with all the chemicals and pesticides and electromagnetics and overstimulation, overconsumption of food, of information, right? The environmental toxins, the pace that we're living at, the stressors that we're experiencing on a daily basis, many of which are self-induced. We're constantly living in this low-level stress response all the time, living as if there's that proverbial lion or tiger chasing us, when in fact it's really just our financial stress, our environmental stress, our nutritional stress. And that stress summates in the body and expresses an overall stress load. And that could be physical illness, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, digestive issues, back pain, or it can be expressed as anxiety, depression, ADD, OCD, bipolar tendencies, schizophrenia, addiction, etc., etc. So the first thing to understand is the evolutionary mismatch between biology and environment. And the second thing to understand is how that's now being expressed in the autonomic nervous system. And remember, anytime you're in a sympathetic fight or flight response, you're always going back to survival mode. You're shifting back into perceiving your reality through the lens of stress or survival. So you might see something long and curvy, and your brain projects it as a snake because it's always looking for potential threats. Anytime you're in that stress response, you're in survival mode. Anytime you're in survival mode, you're always perceiving your reality through the lens of stress and survival. So it's always going to orient itself to the negative because the negative are the threats to our survival, not the positive. A lot of people wonder why there's research that shows that 99% of our thoughts are negative. Not 99, I would say 90. I think it's 90. 90% of our thoughts are negative in orientation, and most people don't understand why. The reason for this is because it's the negative things in life that are a threat to your survival, not the positive ones, right? No one ever died from or was feeling threatened from a birthday party or blowing out birthday candles or being on a romantic date. It's the negative things, the conflicts, the fights, the famines, the financial crisis, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the things that are a threat to our survival. So 90% of our thoughts, it's just because our mind is looking out for those potential threats. And if we're living in a fight or flight state, it even more orients our psyche to the negative, to the threats, constantly scanning the environment for anything that might be a threat to our safety, to our security, or to our survival. In addition to that, when we're in that fight or flight state, we always move into a part of the brain called the default mode network. The default mode network is the part of your brain that says, do what you've always done, think what you've always thought, believe what you've always believed because it's kept you alive until now. Anything that's new, novel, different, or creative is a threat to your survival. So the default mode network always brings you back into the past and brings up a lot of your old habitual patterning, whether it's choices, behaviors, or patterns of thinking that was there to keep us alive. But remember, what kept you alive not necessarily helped you thrive, right? So surviving and thriving don't always go together. And a lot of times the things that help us survive are a threat to our ability to thrive, right? So the default mode always moves us back into what we've always done, how we've always thought, what we've always believed, because that helps ensure our survival. This is why Paul Chek says when you're running from a lion, it's not a good idea to throw in a cartwheel, because anything that's new, novel, different, or creative is a threat to your survival, right? So the cartwheel represents creative thought, which if a lion or a tiger is chasing you, might slow you down and might get you eaten, right? So it's really important to understand this autonomic nervous system and find ways to bring ourselves back into a parasympathetic state. And that could be through things like meditation, Tai Chi, breath work, journaling, gratitude, spending time in nature, etc. So balancing this nervous system is really important. And I'm going to take a sip of water. Hydration is very important as well. Okay. So we have this evolutionary mismatch. We have the overstimulated or imbalanced nervous system. Next, we're going to go to inflammation. We have a culture that's chronically inflamed because of our processed foods, our chronic stress, our chemicals and pesticides, a lot of the pharmaceuticals, you know, mold toxins, environmental toxins, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of these things are causing chronic inflammation in the body. And anytime we're creating chronic inflammation, whether it's through our diet, our lifestyle, our sedentary living, poor sleep, electromagnetics, et cetera, we create an overactive immune system, right? So we have an immune system that's literally on high alert all the time. And the inflammation is really the response from the immune system, whether it's fighting an infection, trying to clean up the gut, foods that are disturbing to the body, et cetera, or chemicals, pesticides, environmental toxins. We have this immune system that's on high alert, that's running on overdrive. And remember, your immune system is your defense mechanism. So it's perceiving things as a threat to you. So once again, body and mind are intricately connected, and as above, so below. So whenever we're creating that stress response in the body, we immediately create a stress response in the psyche. When our body is perceiving things as a threat, our psyche is perceiving things as a threat. So you can imagine the levels of anxiety or ADHD or obsessive compulsive disorder that might arise when we're constantly perceiving threats in our external environment, just like we are doing in our internal environment within our own bodies. So inflammation and an overactive immune system can be a huge cause for a lot of these mental illnesses that we're struggling with. In addition, when we have an overactive immune system, chronic inflammation, we have a breakdown in the barriers, right? The intestinal lining is a barrier. We have the blood-brain barrier. When we have this inflammation, we have a breakdown in the intestinal lining and the cell-to-cell lining of the digestive system and the blood-brain barrier. And we create what's called permeability. We create leaky gut. We have undigested food particles and bacteria and parasites making it into general bloodstream and making it through the intestinal lining. And as this happens, we create more of an infectious, inflammatory immune response. And as the gut barrier starts to break down, a lot of times the blood-brain barrier starts to break down. And now we have inflammation in the brain, leading to a lot of symptoms of depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, OCD, et cetera, et cetera. So whenever we have a leaky gut, we create the possibility of leaky brain, inflammation in the body, overactive immune system, inflammation in the brain, and now we're expressing a lot of these physical and mental disease states. So this is why, gut health, for example, is so critical. Cleaning up the diet, cleaning up the microbiome, healing the gut lining, all of that is so important for our mental health, not just our physical health. And you realize that when the immune system is on high alert, when there's high levels of inflammation, when we have a breakdown in these barriers in the gut lining and the blood-brain barrier, everything we start to perceive as a threat, we're constantly perceiving the food that we're eating, the bacteria, the viruses, the parasites, everything our body's perceiving as a threat. And our psyche, our psychological state, our state of perception starts to mirror that, right? So your brain can really only be as healthy as the body that it's living in. So if your body's constantly preoccupied with threats, your brain, your psyche is constantly going to be preoccupied with threats. And it's going to take what it's experiencing in its internal environment and it's going to project it outward onto the external environment, right? So how we're perceiving the world is a lot of times based on our own physiology, our own biochemistry, and our own autonomic nervous system, right? So we talked about that sympathetic state. Anytime we're in that stress response, we're perceiving our reality through that lens of stress, through that lens of survival, always looking out for potential threats, just like our immune system is doing within our own bodies. And in addition to that, when we have a breakdown in these barriers, we have a breakdown in these boundaries. Remember, the gut lining is a boundary. When we have a breakdown in the intestinal lining, we have undigested food particles and bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungus leaking into your general circulation, into your bloodstream. And the gut lining is meant to essentially be a boundary between everything coming in from the outer environment and everything that's considered to be you. So everything that's considered to be you is in your bloodstream, your general circulation, and your tissues. Everything that's not you on a cellular level is supposed to reside in the gut, and there's meant to be a barrier between the two. So that boundary is what helps you differentiate what's you and what's not you, right? That piece of chicken is not you. Your cells are you. And unfortunately, when we have leaky gut permeability and a breakdown in these barriers, we tend to leak. We have undigested food particles. That piece of chicken is now in your general bloodstream and your circulation. And now your immune system over time has a hard time differentiating what's you and what's not you. So your whole sense of self on a biological, biochemical, cellular level is disrupted when we have a breakdown in these barriers. And a lot of times, once we, just like we said, as above, so below, and as within, so without, what we're experiencing on the inside is exactly what we're experiencing on the outside. So the inability to differentiate self from other can literally be an expression of a leaky gut, permeability in the digestive tract, et cetera, et cetera. And we start noticing these patterns playing themselves out in our lives with things like low self-esteem, low self-worth, the need for external validation and approval, and all those things. Our sense of our own personal empowerment, our personal power, self-will, and our sense of identity of who am I can be simply disrupted with a breakdown in the gut lining, a breakdown in the barriers of the body, whether it's the gut, the brain, et cetera, et cetera. And our ability to differentiate self from other on a cellular level is disrupted, and that gets projected outward. So it's really important that we reduce the levels of inflammation in the body, that we clean up the gut, that we repair these barriers. We start to have a solidified sense of self on a cellular level. So now we have a solidified sense of self on a social and psychological, mental, emotional, and environmental level, right? So micro and macro, these are always mirroring each other. Also, a lot of these mental illnesses are an expression of chronic infections, right? Levels of fungal infections, parasite infections, bacterial overgrowth, viral load. These chronic infections are often at the root of a lot of these mental health challenges. And a lot of it starts in the gut, but a lot of it could be, Lyme disease, things like that. So it's important if you're struggling with anxiety, depression, OCD, ADHD, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, things like that, it's important to look at possible infectious loads. So I would recommend doing things like blood work, stool testing, things like that to identify anything that might be contributing to your symptoms. Even if it seems unrelated, a lot of times they're directly correlated. So we want to look into any chronic infections. And in addition to that, when we have these chronic infections, we're constantly in this state of chronic inflammation, and we're constantly in this low level stress response because our body has this this threat, this enemy that it's constantly preoccupied with. So it's very hard for the body, brain, and nervous system to relax when it's constantly preoccupied with trying to clear infections, which are quote unquote foreign invaders, right? So we start perceiving our whole reality as if anything outside of us is an invader, a threat to our survival, because our own biochemistry is mirroring that and expressing that. In addition, we have the electromagnetics, right? The electromagnetic pollution, the overstimulation from devices and technology is really important to take a look at because that also creates chronic inflammation. That also dysregulates the nervous system. And if there's one thing that I would say is at the root of most, if not all, mental illness, it's an overstimulated nervous system. And one of the key players when it comes to the evolutionary mismatch is the electromagnetics. We did not have all of this electromagnetic stimulation 50, 100, however many years ago, even 30, 40 years ago, we didn't have a lot of this. And if we look at the level of mental illness now, and we look at the rates of electromagnetic pollution and overstimulation and information consumption and all of that, you can see a direct connection. So we really want to make sure that we're diligent about our boundaries with technology, Wi-Fi, cell phones, social media, things like that. So before I move forward, I just want to summarize where we're at thus far. We have this evolutionary mismatch, the challenge between our biology that's still catching up, the environment that's expanding and growing and evolving and progressing at such a rapid pace that it's creating a huge stress response. We talked about the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic fight or flight response, the default mode network shifting into survival mode. We talked about chronic inflammation, an overactive immune system, the breakdown in the barriers of the body, leaky gut, leaky brain, everything becoming a threat to us, unable to differentiate on a cellular level self from other. We talked about the infectious load of fungal and parasite infections, bacterial overgrowth, viral loads, Lyme disease, things like that, how that creates chronic inflammation, brain fog, and a low level stress response all the time. Once again, dysregulating that nervous system. We talked about the electromagnetics, making sure we're setting boundaries with our devices, the overstimulation from social media, overconsumption of information, Wi-Fi. We want to make sure that we're cleaning all of that up. Now we're going to go to dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is something that's been with us for all of humanity. It's nothing new. And dopamine was really designed for, dopamine's the reward center in the brain. So dopamine is designed for us to have a rewarding experience after completing something hard, overcoming an obstacle, or finishing a task, right? So you do a project, you do a workout, you go hunting and you forage and you find that meal. There's something that you do that's challenging, that's rewarding. You complete the task, and now you have the rewarding experience of celebrating what you had just completed. And that's what dopamine is really for. It's the neurochemical of reward. But unfortunately, especially with our food industry, the technology industry, a lot of our consumerist-based culture is rooted in the drive of dopamine, right? The food system, the social media platforms, these are all designed to appeal to the dopamine reward centers in the brain. And the levels of addiction to dopamine are so insanely high, and we're all guilty of it. I mean, when it comes to processed sugar, processed foods, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. The challenge we run into is dopamine, that reward neurochemical experience, was designed after we complete a hard task, complete a project, complete a workout. But now we can get that same neurochemical experience in a matter of seconds. All you have to do is open your cabinet to get the food, the processed food, the highly palliative foods, or all you have to do is take your phone and click on Instagram or Twitter or TikTok, and you have the neurochemical experience of dopamine, the reward experience, without having to go through any sort of process to get there. So this is creating a lot of addiction. This is creating a lot of anxiety and depression, mood swings, brain fog. It's creating a lot of patterns of apathy and procrastination and depression. So this dopamine addiction is really important to understand how much our culture is driven by instant gratification, and our capacity for also emotional intelligence is inhibited when we're so dopamine driven, but don't actually have to go through a process of getting to that space of having that rewarding experience. So what I would invite you to do is also take a look at where you are driven by cheap sources of dopamine and ways you can start cutting back on that and implementing healthy sources of dopamine, whether it be through exercise, artwork, painting, completing a puzzle, doing a hard project, overcoming certain obstacles in your life where you feel that rewarding experience. In addition, with all of these things that we have available to us at any given moment, whether it's the processed food, the social media, et cetera, it's so easy for us to check out and disconnect from ourselves. Historically, when we had a bad day, we would reconnect with the tribe. We would sit by the fire, talk things out. We would process things. But nowadays, when we have a challenging day, we just plop in front of the television, turn on Netflix, zone out on YouTube, scroll through Instagram. So nothing really gets processed. Our emotions don't get felt, things don't get talked through. And, buried emotions never die. And whatever you're not feeling gets stored in your tissues, gets stored in your nervous system, and creates a stress response on a very low level because that stuff is still inside of you, having gone unresolved. So we want to be careful as to how much we're checking out versus how much time we're actually spending tuning in, right? And there's just so many ways for us to check out nowadays. We want to make sure that we're spending just as much time tuning in as we are checking out. So that's another important element to this as well. The next piece we're going to dive into is something a little bit more esoteric, something a little bit more subtle, but something that I've seen very consistently in my life, in my one-on-one coaching practice with clients and students that I've worked with, both one-on-one and in my coaching programs, which is, this is going to be more on a spiritual level. On a spiritual level, a lot of the souls that are incarnating, over the last, say, 20 to 25 years are quite high vibrational beings that are coming into form. And from my perspective, they're healers, they're mystics, they're here to bring change to a culture and a society so drastically in need of change and in need of a bit of an upgrade in terms of consciousness and awareness. But when you take a high vibrational being, a high level of consciousness, and you bring that energy into form, it's sometimes very hard for those individuals to navigate this 3D physical reality with that high level of frequency within a human body and within a human nervous system. So if those individuals who are also highly sensitive and empathic aren't able to ground themselves and have the tools to support their nervous system, support their body, and stay grounded and centered, it can become quite magnified. Kelly Brogan talks about the canaries in the coal mines. These are the energetically sensitive, empathic, high vibrational beings that are coming into this environment and are magnifying the imbalances and expressing a lot of these disease states to make us aware of where we're out of balance. And a lot of these souls are of a high level of consciousness, but are having a hard time bringing that high vibrational state down into this physical 3D reality of form. Those beings are much more attuned to the formless. So coming down into form with that level of frequency is actually quite challenging, which is why you also see a lot of these individuals are very psychically open. They might be clairvoyant or telepathic or psychic. And a lot of times, if these abilities go untrained, ungrounded, they can be expressed as things like anxiety, schizophrenia, OCD, ADHD, because they're not able to harness those abilities. And it's kind of high risk, high reward when it comes to those frequencies, right? So these beings are very sensitive, they're very empathic, they feel things very deeply and are also very psychically open. So there's great potential for those beings to be healers and shamans and teachers and mystics. But if they're not trained, then it can become expressed as a pathology rather than a gift. And unfortunately, our Western medical model tends to pathologize a lot of what are really gifts. So it's something for us all to be aware of, whether this sounds like you, or maybe you have a child that is quite psychically open, sensitive, and empathically connected, but expresses things like anxiety or depression or OCD or symptoms of schizophrenia. They say that it's a very fine line between spiritual awakening and psychosis. And, if you look into shamanism, they speak to this a lot. So we really want to make sure that we're honoring these beings with respect and reverence for what they're really coming here with and what they truly have to offer, and make sure that we're not pathologizing the gift, because it's really here for us to receive. So in summary, I gave you a pretty clear outline of what's really going on with this mental health crisis. We have this evolutionary mismatch between biology and environment creating a huge stress response. We have the autonomic nervous system, the overstimulated nervous system. We have the chronic inflammation, the breakdown in the barriers of the body. We have the overactive immune system, everything becoming a threat, unable to differentiate self from other on a cellular level. We have the chronic infectious load that needs to be cleaned up because it's creating a lot of inflammation and, this low level stress response all the time. And in addition to that, something I didn't mention, the gut microbiome is really the home to our mental health. Why is that? That is because many of our neurotransmitters are produced in the gut by our gut bacteria, not actually our brain. For example, 90% of your serotonin is actually made by your gut bacteria, not your brain, right? So the number one drug sold for anxiety, depression, etc., they're SSRIs, which work on the levels of serotonin in the brain. And a lot of doctors, before prescribing SSRIs, are not looking into people's gut health to see how their gut microbiome is, how their gut permeability is, how their digestive system is working. And unfortunately, this gets overlooked, but a lot of these medications are being prescribed to people that have, a disrupted gut microbiomes, which is why maybe their neurochemistry, their neurotransmitters, hormones, etc., are out of balance. And we're medicating the symptoms. We're not addressing the root cause here. So I just wanted to throw that in, that the gut microbiome is actually the home to a lot of our neurotransmitter production. And a lot of the medications that we're using to try and rebalance these neurotransmitters, it's actually a symptom of what's happening in the gut with our gut bacteria. So that's why I wanted to mention that when it comes to chronic infections. We talked about the electromagnetics, the overconsumption of information, the overstimulation from devices and technology. We want to make sure we're having clear boundaries with that. We want to take a look at our dopamine addiction, where we're looking for cheap sources of dopamine as a way of checking out, seeking instant gratification, rather than going through a challenging process, doing a hard project, a hard workout, completing a puzzle, things like that, to achieve the dopamine response that it was really designed for, which is to reward us for accomplishing something. And then we want to also look into, highly energetically sensitive beings, empathic beings, high vibrational states, individuals that are psychically open but are expressing a disease state because it's hard for them to work with those energies in this 3D reality. And what we're pathologizing are really, divine gifts that are here for us all to receive. So what is the starting point here? The starting point here is always the lowest hanging fruit. I love Paul Chek's teachings on the four doctors. Dr. Diet, how you're feeding yourself. Dr. Quiet, how you're resting. Dr. Movement, how you're moving your body. Dr. Happiness, how you're expressing your creativity, your purpose, your mission, and how you're creating happiness for yourself. So my invitation to you is always start with the low hanging fruit. Eat organic food. Get to bed by 10 p.m. Get a good half hour of movement or exercise each day. Spend some time in quiet, in meditation, tuning in rather than checking out. Spend some time expressing your creativity. Spend time out in nature, less time on devices. Let's really go after the low-hanging fruit and find, social connection rather than isolation. These are all essential pieces of the puzzle. Make sure we're setting boundaries with technology, not over-consuming information and overstimulation. It's really important that we start with these basic foundational principles and then build upon that with any complex interventions that might be necessary. But I always say simplicity before complexity. You can't put the cart before the horse. So I hope you enjoyed this episode together. I really enjoyed sharing this with you. And in future episodes, we're going to dive into some deeper material on some of the specifics around anxiety, depression, addiction, and so much more. And if you'd like to take a deeper dive, I have my online program, Healing the Mind, A Journey to Wholeness, which is my flagship 21-day program that takes a fully holistic and integrative approach to mental health. It's full of guided meditations, nutrition for mental health, breath work, movement practices. We dive into shamanism, Chinese medicine, archetypes, addiction. There's so much material in there for you. It's a 21-day journey, and I'm so excited to share that program with you. It's a great fit if this podcast really resonated with you. So if you look in the show notes, you'll see the links there, or go to healing4d.com/HTM, and I have a 20% discount code for you. If you use the code podcast20 at checkout, you can save 20% off. So Healing the Mind, A Journey to Wholeness is a great program to support you if you'd like to explore a lot of these concepts and dive into the healing of your own mental health, any mental health challenges that you or one of your loved ones might be struggling with. And I look forward to sharing more with you guys on a future podcast. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.